Hey, Scott, thanks for talking to me about this CSDM 4.0 topic around product models and product management and life cycles.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Mark.
So as we start rolling up CSDM version 4, I think folks are starting to kind of look at the material that's out there. We have this product models here, that's part of it, and we've also added additional information around life cycles and how we're going to manage life cycles between defining the product models and how those relate to various entities within the rest of the model here. So do you want to give a little bit of a backstory on how that works and how the intent is for that product models and how that interaction and relationship references from all the CIs that we have on the model?
Sure. So we introduced the concept of product model inside of CSDM with version 3 and part of Foundation, more of kind of an introduction to let everyone know that, hey, this is an important object. And the importance of it actually goes back to, I want to say, to the Berlin release when asset management was created. And that's where we reference on a configuration item as well as on an asset record, what is the model or the product that this object represents? And so if we were to say, looking at end user computing and laptops, we know that this is a particular model of MacBook Pro. Rather than trying to duplicate that data on every single object, it becomes referential. From there, that expanded. So historically, asset management has utilized product models, and it's a required element on asset records, whether it's a hardware model, a consumable model, or software. But it expanded beyond that. There's also models that exist for contracts. The CSM team expanded model types into service models. So now that became different types of models or products. And our point of view is that everything is a product. So there's different types. So whether we're talking about services, so that gets us to our business services, our offerings, and our technical services, or whether we're talking about software. And so software being a very specific version of software that could represent our application services and some of our applications that Discovery finds. And then, of course, hardware becomes those pieces that are physical hosts that Discovery also finds. And Discovery has utilized these product models for years, creating them whenever they find certain software or hardware models out in the environment. How the actual hierarchy works is it starts at the top called a product model, and it's seemed to be underscore model. And you can't actually create a record in that particular table. You're actually asked what type of product or model you want to have. And so there's extended tables from that core product model table. And so depending on the type that you're looking for. So I mentioned earlier the hardware model, the software model, the consumable, the service model. There's also an application model, and it's actually important to understand the nuance of how application model and software model go together. Application model is version agnostic. There's absolutely no model associated with it, but there is a version associated to software model. So essentially, an application model is the parent, and the software model is the child. So an application model can have multiple children, multiple software models, where it's the software model that says what version. So we could be talking about a particular application and not concerned about any versioning whatsoever, and that's the application model, where the software model is going to be specific to what actual version exists. So this overall view of a product, and again, we say that everything is a product, whether it's hardware or software or service. All of these pieces are products, and these are lightweight objects that identify an owner, give a description of what it is, and also, thanks to our asset management team, have a concept that they call lifecycle, which is a little different than ours. But their concept of lifecycle was originally created to identify on these models when is the last time, for example, software, that a manufacturer or publisher is going to support that product. When's the last time they're going to answer the phone call when you call up for support? Or if it's code, when's the last time they're going to apply patches? So you start to track dates, and those are called external life cycles. And those dates are extremely important. It's actually a critical element within application portfolio management, a capability called TPM, in order to identify the risk associated with end of life dates to various products. The asset team expanded that to hardware. And we've had requests from many customers to provide that same capability on services. The example from a CSM perspective is we sell a particular service in 2021 and it comes with these particular commitments, but it's only going to last for that year. In 2022, we're going to have a different service. And we're going to want to know which one did you buy that had particular commitments. So we're actually versioning services just as we are versioning software or hardware.
Right, right.
Are giving us dates about that risk, but those are external. So there's also internal. It could be that your security department wants to say, hey, these particular products in our environment, we need to no longer have after this particular date for such and such reason. So you can identify end of life dates for internal reasons as much as external reasons. And when we start talking about end of life and end of service, there's different types of end of life and end of service, but that's where that data is stored on a product model. And then by referencing this product model object throughout the platform onto its assets, onto its configuration items, we limit the extra data or customization that's necessary on a CI, as an example, and instead put it on that unifying object at the top, which is that product model, the data that can be shared across all instances of that product.
Yeah, so we're going to basically, a lot of folks will create product and as CIs, but that's a heavy object, right? I mean, managing a CI means that the product is already purchased, it's actually implemented somewhere, and we're managing it for configurations and changes for, incident, problem, and change kind of processes, that sort of thing. And then, of course, asset management is sort of linked in there as well. So, asset management would have an asset record that would possibly also be referencing those CIs as a, it exists now. It's an instantiation. Is that correct?
I like to consider a configuration item to be an instance of a product. It's a point in time object where it's giving you the details of that configuration within a particular life cycle. And when you say a heavy object, it's extremely heavy, because with that, you're synchronizing who's the responsibility for that configuration item, who's going to support it, who's responsible for any sort of changes that go along with it. And there's a lot more when it starts coming from security perspective, as well as data management. So the heavy, your statement that a CI is a heavy object is extremely accurate, because there's a lot of data that goes along with a CI that's not necessary for a product model.
Yeah, so if we had a product model for everything, and every CI, let's say every single CI had that reference, because this is our CI structure, right? And it's got this model ID reference. So we wouldn't have to store so much crap down at the CI level. We would just reference, the software that's been bought from a vendor, or the service that I've defined, at a high level, or even version by version level. And then down here is where they are instantiated. Is that correct?
That is correct. And in the future, we are going to be helping customers auto create and populate those model records with CIs as well as assets, so that it's not a manual activity to go in and create all of these all the time. And you mentioned essentially COTS software, the software that we purchase, which is obviously a critical focus of asset management and software asset management. But we also want to use those same objects for the bespoke, the things that we create ourselves. So what are the softwares that we are creating? How does that relate to other requirements inside of our environment? And then let's get some versions to them, and where are they implemented, and how do they have dependencies on other software instances or application service instances within our environment.
Yeah, so essentially I can have a more product management discipline managing these products up here, declaring when the next version's out, and it goes from ideation all the way through, building the thing, deploying it, and then eventually operating it, right? So the build, release, and then operations would all kind of come into play.
And I'm glad you brought up the ideation, because this is also another reason why a configuration item is just not the right choice to use in this scenario of the life cycle. There are scenarios where you'll have an idea and you don't move forward with it. The last thing we want to do is create that heavy-handed configuration item object for something that we're not even going to use or move forward out of the idea gate. So with a product model, we can still have that library of these are ideas for products that we've had in the past and the reasons for it, and reference those within our ideation, whether it's demands or ideas, to know that that existed without having to create a configuration item. So that makes it much less of an impact on the platform, and it makes performance better.
Yeah, yeah. And I just wanted to bring this up, this idea of these things are going to be created along the way, and the product model is really the where we would want to actually do all this work on it until it becomes a real thing, right? And it's built, it's now operational. That's kind of where we have to deal with those CI elements.
Correct. Create a CI when you need to have a CI, not just because you can.
Yeah, yeah. And I think a lot of the things that we're doing in the platform in terms of applying these new lifecycle fields that we've created, the lifecycle stage and lifecycle status, and that's what we've documented here. Like, this is the stage up here, right? And then the status under that stage is what we have down below.
Correct.
Okay. Okay. So like up to this point, you're still dealing with things that are actually on the drawing board, so to speak. They can live in the product model space without having to deal with anything that's actually operational yet. But you still have a product model record that would indicate that these things are either, end of life. But these aren't the instances here at the product model. These are just speaking at the high level, describing the thing, who's the owner of it, and then re-referencing, of course, from a product model to all those instances.
Correct. And so
Okay.
that, to the point made earlier, we don't have to have all of this data on a single configuration item. We all know how that impacts performance of the platform when we do too much on a configuration item. When we don't need that configuration item and use a much more lightweight object, now we can track it through its life cycle and only have a CI when you need to have a CI. And in many scenarios, it's where you have a specific instance of a product.
That's right. You've ordered it, it's in place, or you built it. Now it's got to be managed till you don't need it anymore. And
Correct.
so when we get into like hardware and software, you got up until this point, right? You don't really even have an asset. Here you have looks like you have the asset.
Correct.
And then this is really where you care about creating the actual CI. It's actually here. it's on premise, and now you're understanding some of the where it's being deployed and how it's operating. Is that correct?
Right. So as soon as you move towards deploying, that's when you're going to need that CI, because now you want to make sure you can identify it in a change record if necessary. So that's where you want to make sure that CI exists. In today's world, of course, ServiceNow creates the asset record and the CI simultaneously. So if we're creating the asset, you're going to simultaneously have the CI, and vice versa. If Discovery comes through and creates a CI because they find it, then we'll simultaneously create the asset. But in the future, and the future can be distant, it's not going to be anytime soon. In the future, moving even more to your point, we don't need that CI until we go to deploy. So it'll be an improvement on the performance of the platform when we don't have to simultaneously create the asset and the CI at the same time. So we'll create the asset because we're purchasing it, we've received it, we have it in inventory. As soon as we move to deploy, then we can create a CI and move towards having that operational. It's deployed, and incidents are being put against it, or other details. And then from there, you get to determine what's going to happen to this piece of hardware once you no longer need to use it for its current function. Do we put it back into inventory and reuse it, or do we end of life it and go ahead and go through a disposal process? So that's the life cycle. So when you start thinking of life cycle as a process, which is where this diagram here starts to show the overall process of how life cycle can work, you start to see how these functions will be much more deliberate for each of the types of configuration items and assets in the system.
Yeah, yeah. And I like to think about discovery as sort of after everything happens is when we are actually discovering things. All of this stuff is missing. It's like it hadn't even been recorded properly, so we don't understand what we're discovering. It might have been an idea a year ago, and now we're just now discovering it.
Right. In a perfect scenario, this is the process where you actually have the details, and discovery acts more as validation as opposed to creation of the environment. But for many organizations that aren't entirely mature or using an entire process, discovery becomes their first leg into asset management. But the asset management space has matured quite a bit, especially with ServiceNow's hardware asset management and then the future enterprise asset management. You're going to start to see that overall process that begins much sooner is going to allow you to get greater control, both from an operational standpoint and a financial standpoint inside of the environment.
Yeah, I mean, because you're buying these assets for a reason, or building them, and the cost to build them, right, has to be accounted for somewhere.
Right. And we want to work. I mean, oftentimes that process is not automated. So the more that we can automate it and workflow it, the more insight we get into it and can we reduce more costs.
Yeah, and I know we've introduced some APIs to be able to, for example, create these things after they're purchased or implemented through like a CI/CD pipeline. If you're doing a deployment automatically, we can hit the API and basically update the records as such.
And that would
So,
align in the segment that is non-hardware.
yeah, yeah. So when we get into like non-hardware and the logical side,
Yes.
yeah. I like to describe this one. You can't lose a logical item, so there's no missing or stolen, right? So there's a lot of changes here. But yeah, and then of course in the design, you're designing things logically here as well, especially as you combine software. Certain software versions need to work together. We're able to articulate that here as well.
And this is where the new lifecycle management actually has the great value. You start to see the difference, as you pointed out, between a hardware object and a logical object. In the old world, we had no less than 8 or 9 attributes contributing to status, which is what lifecycle is. And none of them worked together, and none of them provide the appropriate view specific to that type of object. So now with our new lifecycle, we're giving you a view that's specific to that type of object. If it's a hardware configuration item, then you should see hardware related choices. If it's a logical item, like we're going through here, then we should see logical elements. To your point, you wouldn't expect anything that's lost or stolen. So we don't need to show those. It just frustrates customers and end users and confuses many.
Yeah, I mean, you end up selecting the wrong thing. It makes no sense later on, right? So
it also allows us to have consistency. So we now have specific objects to look for and a process behind each of them so that we can start to help workflow and automate those pieces as opposed to being a manual activity. So now that we know what the process should be for each of the types, we can code towards it.
yeah, so basically you select the life cycle and the right statuses are available for that life cycle stage. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, and there's no rush. My understanding is that there's no rush to actually use these yet, but I do have a lot of customers that want to use them because they want to report better. And so what do they do with all the legacy stuff if they're looking at operational status or other kind of status information, lifecycle information? How does that get updated here?
So that's a great question. We decided to implement this in slow stages without any requirements, so customers aren't forced to turn this on and use it. And the reason for that is because just as customers have a lot of dependency on the legacy attributes, the operational status and install status and et cetera, even our own products have some dependencies on some of those old legacy statuses. So what we did is we created a mapping mechanism. The first one we did was forward mapping. So based off of the objects that are available inside of the legacy attributes, again, whether it's operational status or any of the other 8 or 9 statuses, we did a mapping exercise of what those equal in the new lifecycle stage and lifecycle stage status.
Yeah,
so that if someone is continuing to use the legacy attributes and enable the new lifecycle stage and lifecycle stage status, based off of what is in the legacy data, it'll automatically update and populate the new attributes based off of what those values are inside the mapping. The next thing we did is a reverse mapping. So if you turn this on and you start to use the new lifecycle stage and stage status and make a modification to it, we did a reverse mapping to the legacy attributes so that we will update those legacy attributes whenever you make a modification to the new attributes. So that forward and reverse mapping is what keeps them in line. The forward mapping is the easiest. The reverse mapping is not 100%. The reason for that is there are some scenarios specifically in hardware status where there are multiple choices for one of those combinations from lifecycle stage and lifecycle stage status. And we just chose one. So it's not a perfect reverse mapping, but we also found that not a lot of customers are using those hardware statuses to that detail. So we didn't see that that was going to be a major impact.
okay.
But this forward and reverse mapping allows customers to identify where they may have legacy dependencies on the old attributes, as well as our own products or third parties, partners that have created solutions, provided solutions. It allows everyone to have a cushion, so to speak, of how long it takes or desired to implement. So there's no rush to do it. And when the action is done, there is mapping here to help keep it in sync.
Okay, so in Quebec is when we did the forward mapping, right? I think, and then Rome is where we do the reverse mapping part. Yeah.
It's taken
Okay.
multiple releases to slowly get this in because it's a pretty large effort.
Yeah. Now, what about customers that are starting out for the very first time on Rome and they're kind of confused about that legacy mapping? And I know in the doc site, it does explain that this is legacy and there's the new CSDM and the mapping processes there and all that. What would you suggest folks that are just new to the platform, starting on Rome for the very first time? What would you suggest they do?
So it's going to be an education piece. So unfortunately, even new customers are going to have to understand the new and the old. So you can start using the new attributes, but there's still some products that will be referencing and using the legacy attributes. So you need to be aware of them. But the recommendation, if at all possible, is to utilize the new, if that's acceptable, and start building your new dependencies on the new attributes, but just be aware of the legacy because there are still products using the legacy, and that's going to be a few releases until they all migrate over.
Yeah, so those products that are currently using all the legacy, they're going to be migrating still beyond Rome, right? Somewhere we expect maybe what, Tokyo or Utah even for some of them.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
There's a lot of really in-depth capabilities that we have that it's not a simple migration.
Right. Okay, so when it comes to like reporting though, they should be able to turn on the map, the forward mapping at least, and do reporting off the new legacy stages and status, right? Or
that's the dependency that I'm talking about. You don't want to start on the platform and start building your brand new capabilities and dependencies on data objects that you know are legacy and are going to be moving away. So that's why all possible you're comfortable using the new attributes, then start with your reporting off of the new attributes because you're then building a new dependency, and that way you're using the correct objects.
Yeah, and we're starting to see customers that have processes on top of this they want to be able to automate and then integrate into the platform. Again, is that an area that they also want to leverage the new lifecycle stages and statuses wherever possible?
Correct. And that's one of the primary capabilities and reasons why we have those new objects, so that we can use those and build processes off of them that are much more effective than the legacy attributes.
Okay. Well, cool. This has been helpful, Scott. I mean, I don't have any other questions. Any other tidbits around this whole, like I would say, product-centric shift, and then also the lifecycle shift that you want to tell folks?
It's a big shift on both topics for very good and big reasons. So if anyone has questions or wants to learn more, then definitely reach out to us. But this is a big direction, and it's going to help improve both customer process as well as performance on the platform. So we're really excited.
Yeah, excellent. I also wanted to bring up the fact that we do have a mapping between the old and the new, and that will be available also in the CSDM version 4. Is that correct?
Correct.
So folks that are kind of wondering what's new versus what the legacy stuff is and how that kind of plays out, they'll be able to look that up and also see it in the CSDM Navigator, the mapping settings, right?
Correct.
Excellent. Cool. All right, Scott, that helps a lot. I'm going to make sure that this gets out to the many community members that are asking about it, and we'll hopefully answer all their questions about life cycles and products where we're going.
Sounds great. Thanks, Mark.